struggle, we are proud to present this event tonight in this room, in this building, as Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. So maybe that's the key to organizing a big crowd. You struggle for 2 years, just 2 years. There is a lot that we could say, and we have a tendency to say a lot, about the struggle with the center, about the work of QAIA, and about the core issues. But we're not going to do that we're not going to make a statement tonight as QAIA, because we have someone who will be giving not only a reading, but also a presentation, who will be addressing the core issues quite thoroughly. But as I said, we always have something to say, so we found another way to do it. So we want to make sure everybody has one of these statements. If you didn't get it, you can pick it up again at the table, or we'll get it to you. Please take a minute to pick it up and read it. And at the end of the evening, we'll have a short quiz. No. I'll just say a word or two about, also, we want to remind people, if you haven't signed in on your way in, please sign in on your way out. We'd like to know who you are, and we want to encourage all of you, if possible, if you're not yet on our email list, to join that list. Just sign up at the table. A few words about how the evening's going to go. After I conclude, which will really just be another few minutes here, our speaker, I think you all know who that is, Sarah Schulman. She will do a reading from her book, from her latest book, and she will make some comments, and then there will be a question and answer period. At the end of the evening, if the books are here, or when they get here, there will be time for a book signing. So we want to work that into the evening as well. We ask politely that everybody sort of take a leap of faith with us and accept a few ground rules. Nothing complicated, nothing dramatic. One is, please don't hand out literature during the event. Afterwards, fine. Give out whatever you want to give out, but not during it. Please don't interrupt Sarah while she's reading and talking. There will be a question and answer period. That's the time to raise whatever's on your mind. We are thrilled that so many people came out tonight. We believe that tonight will be another example of a large group of people getting together, having a civil and polite conversation. Not everybody in the room has to agree on every point. What we do ask is that you raise whatever disagreements you might have in a polite and respectful way, so we can have a give and take and an exchange of ideas. That's what it's all about. Finally, I'm sorry, one other quick point. We are filming tonight. So we had hoped to actually do this live streaming, but I don't know, all the technical stuff, it couldn't happen. So we are filming, and we hope to be able to post the video very soon on our blog and hopefully other places. Okay. Finally, one quick word of content about being here tonight at the center. And that's a word about hate speech. We do not condone or encourage hate speech. And we do not and will not let an accusation of hate speech silence us. Being critical of the Israeli government, being critical of the occupation, being critical of apartheid is not hate speech. before I introduce Sarah, which is again what the evening's all about, we need your help with one other thing. We need your money. And we have two lovely baskets, and maybe two people can help us. People do this. One of the interesting things about being at the center is that we have to pay for the rental of the rooms. They don't come for nothing. So we have this room reserved, and we have two other meetings lined up, which are, the information is at the end of the statement about when those meetings are. And so we need to raise about $300 tonight. So that means, if my mind is sharp enough, if everybody gave $2, we'd have it. If you want to give more, that's fine. And if you can't give anything, okay. If you see your neighbor can't throw in anything, maybe you could throw in 4. But it would be a big help if we could raise the money to cover the room rentals for tonight and the other 2 meetings. Now, and as that is circulating, and we can do a money collection quietly, Oral History Project and co-producer of the featured documentary film United in Anger, A History of ACT UP. Her awards include a Guggenheim in playwriting, a Fulbright in Judaic Studies, book awards from the American Library Association in both fiction and nonfiction, and the Kessler Prize for significant contribution to LGBT studies. She is Distinguished Professor of Humanities at the City University of New York, and somehow, with all that, she has time to be on the front line of all the struggles that are important to us. So please welcome Sarah Schulman.
Because we're a community, and we know each other over many years, and we come together when it's necessary, and I wish that the center would develop some kind of transparency where we could understand how they make their crappy decisions. So I decided that I would simply give you exactly the talk I would have given if this hadn't happened, so that you can see exactly what they are censoring. Okay, so let's just start from the beginning. Hello. My book starts out with a quote from Theodore Herzl, from his book, The Jewish State, which was written in 1896. We shall not take others unawares or mislead them any more than we shall deceive ourselves. It was about 2 weeks after the July 2006 Israeli bombing of Lebanon. I was having dinner with a Lebanese friend, the gay novelist Rabbi Ahmadine. I don't get it, he said. In the 13 years that I've lived in this country, many of my friends, maybe most of my friends, have been Jews. We usually agree on everything. Sometimes they're more left-wing than I am. We agree about the war in Iraq, but then Israel invades Lebanon, and suddenly they don't get it. They get it about Iraq. But all of a sudden they're telling me that Israel has a right to defend itself, etc., and I'm shocked. I mean, what's going on, Sarah? Why don't they get it? Well, I've been trying to answer his question ever since, starting with myself. Getting it, that transformation of my own personal relationship to the state of Israel, has been a long, subtle, slow, stubborn journey that has taken a lifetime. One of the strangest things about willful ignorance regarding Israel and Palestine is how often progressive people like myself, with histories of community activism and awareness, engage in it. In this way, it somewhat parallels the history of homophobia, in that there are emotional blocks that keep many straight people from applying their general value systems to human rights for all. The irony in my case of being a lifelong activist and not doing the work to get it about Israel is deep and hard to both understand and convey. But I've come to learn that this insistent blindness is pervasive. And I want to use the opportunity of this book to confront and expose my own denial in a way that I hope will be helpful to others. So let me start with the example of my own story. I was born in 1958, 13 years after the end of the Holocaust, which is not a long time. It would be like a Rwandan Tutsi being born today. I was born only 3 years after my maternal grandmother finally confirmed, as post-war chaos subsided, that her 2 brothers and 2 sisters had been exterminated by the Nazis and their collaborators 10 to 15 years before. The reason it took her until 1955 was that everything was so chaotic. You know, there were no records, nobody knew where anybody was. And of course she had fantasized that they were wandering in the Soviet Union or resettled in Israel, but in fact they had been murdered. My father's parents were starving, uneducated peasants in Russia who came to the United States before the Russian Revolution. They worked in sweatshops. My grandmother actually worked briefly at the Triangle factory before the fire, and finally opened a clothing store in Elizabeth, New Jersey. My father grew up over the store. He was raised with an adopted sister who had watched her mother and brother be murdered by Cossacks in Russia while she hid in the fireplace. My mother's father came to the United States alone as a child from Russia, and 40 years later his sister was murdered by Nazis at Baba Yar. Both of my maternal grandparents were laundry workers in Brooklyn who spent their lives washing other people's clothes. In other words, my background was typical of my Jewish generation, soaked in blood, trauma, and dislocation. Now, I think it's fair to say that my parents were afraid of Christians. They never socialized with Christians, which was not that hard growing up in New York City in the 50s and 60s. They found Christians strange, hard to talk to, and hard to read. I had never even heard of Jesus Christ until some kid explained it to me on the playground, that there was this guy named Jesus, and he was the Son of God. When I came home, I asked my grandmother, "Who is Jesus Christ?" "Look," she said, "there was a girl named Mary, and she got in trouble, so she's Only in New York do people laugh at that. My mother fervently opposed racism, but did not socialize with black people, and I think it was because they weren't Jewish. I was brought up to believe that Christians were not trustworthy and are all at base anti-Semites, and I never heard a bad word about an Arab. We were raised with 2 Yiddish concepts about Christians, kopf and punim. Okay, that's your mind and your face. A Yiddische Kopf and a Goyische Kopf. To say that someone had a Yiddische Kopf, a Jewish mind, was to say admiringly that he was a genius, that he was analytical and conceptual and an original thinker. To say that someone had a Goyische Kopf was to say that he was dull-witted, conformist, and slow, like, oy, a Goyische Kopf. But Yiddische Punim, Jewish face, was highly undesirable, signaling large features, kinky hair, and dark skin. A Goyische Punim was what everyone wanted. Blonde hair, blue eyes, small nose. My mother, who I resemble exactly, always thought that she was ugly because she was dark, and her sister was beautiful because she was blonde. In the early 1960s, a female Jewish copywriter with brown hair wrote the 2 most successful advertising slogans of her era. "If I have one life, let me live it as a blonde," and "Blondes have more fun." My grandmother's brother had been recruited from Poland in 1920 by a Zionist pioneer movement called Neue Zioni, New Zion, which is historically interesting because his name was in Yiddish, not Hebrew, the resuscitated ancient language refabricated for the new Jewish state. Only a few decades later, Israel would discourage the speaking of Yiddish. "You're in Israel, speak Hebrew," signs would command newly arriving refugees from World War II until they drove Yiddish out of existence. Yiddish was the language of Treblinka, was a common Israeli perception. But at this early date, the Zionist movement enrolled young Jewish men and women in Yiddish who knew they had no future in Europe. Zionism had been articulated by Theodor Herzl, a Viennese journalist who was sent to Paris to cover the Alfred Dreyfus trial. After observing the viciousness with which the anti-Semitic French framed poor Colonel Dreyfus, Herzl wrote his book, The Jewish State, attesting that Jews would never be safe in Europe, and he was right. What he missed was that Muslims would never be safe there either. I grew up surrounded by Holocaust survivors. The tailor who sewed in his shop window across the street had a number on his arm. My first girlfriend when I was 16 was the daughter of German Jewish refugees living in Jackson Heights, Queens, where they could buy their German sausages and newspapers. Our family shopped at a children's clothing store in Brooklyn called Borland's, run by a bunch of friends who had all been in the same concentration camp. They had numbers on their arms and screamed at each other across the store. The kids I went to elementary and high school with who had the most fearful, neurotic parents were the children of survivors. I remember a few who had to go straight home after school. They weren't allowed to go to the park. Some of their homes were anguished, confusing places. They yelled at each other for no reason and didn't know how to be happy, and I thought that was normal, because I'd grown up around this all my life. "We didn't have bread to eat" is the sentence I most frequently remember hearing my father's mother say when talking about her childhood under the Tsar. See, Jews to us were people who had been arbitrarily violated and could not trust the other. Israel was a faraway place where pioneers needed money to plant trees and make the desert bloom. America was a scary land filled with pale faces who weren't very bright. New York was home to dark people who yelled when they wanted to and said what they felt. Western Europe was sophisticated and treacherous, while Eastern Europe had gotten what it deserved. If you had told 6-year-old me in 1964 that someday Jewish people with guns would go into villages and commit atrocities, I would have thought you were insane. It was absolutely unimaginable. I didn't know that they already had. So that's where I come from, and I think probably for some of you it's a familiar background. Then in 2000, so I managed to somehow avoid completely facing the situation in Israel. And I managed it successfully for a very long time. I knew that something was wrong, and I wasn't raised, it's funny because the word Zionist is thrown around a lot now. But to us, a Zionist was a person who moved to Israel. Like you'd say, what happened to Joe? And you'd say, oh, he became a Zionist, he moved to Tel Aviv. Oh, you're kidding. Like, it wasn't about an ideological relationship to the Jewish state. I mean, our family was never going to move to Israel, so we weren't Zionists. But it didn't mean we were anti-Zionists. The relationship with Israel was an entirely emotional and sentimental relationship because after all the blood and murder that my family had experienced, that's where our relatives lived. And so we were tied to it on those terms. Anyway, this eventually changed for me, and I want to share with you how that changed. And it's still in the process of changing. But basically, I came to it very, very late. In 2009, I published an article, a book called Ties That Bind, Familial Homophobia and Its Consequences. And as a result, I got an invitation to give the keynote address at the Lesbian and Gay Studies Conference at Tel Aviv University. Now, I very much wanted to go because my family had been pathologically homophobic, and I was moved by the thought of talking about this issue in Israel. And so I was all ready to go. But a colleague of mine, a Turkish Jew, said, well, you know, there's a boycott. And I said, what boycott? I had never heard of it. She said, well, you know, you should find out about it. So I said, okay, I'll find out about it. So I spent the next 3 months finding out about it. The first thing I did, because I always go right to the top, is I emailed Judith Butler. I also emailed Naomi Klein, but she never got back to me. And I said to her, you know, blah, 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 what is this boycott, you know, da, 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 because I had heard her speak at CUNY a couple years before. And her talk had really made an impression on me. It was the first time I had heard anyone talk about Palestinian right of return. It was something that it was a phrase I had never heard before. So I wrote to her, and she, being a very good teacher, sent me a reading list. You know, and one of the articles that she sent me was by Neve Gordon, who is a professor at Bar-Ilan University, and he published an article in The Guardian in which he asked us to help save Israel from itself. You know, and that was a phrase that really affected me. And then she put me in touch with queer Jewish academics in Israel who were part of a movement called Boycott from Within. So it's interesting looking back now, because the truth is, And I've had to face a lot of things about myself in this process. I only went to Jews at the beginning. And I think that unconsciously I wanted them to say it was okay for me to go, but they didn't. You know, and I'm lucky that there are so many Jews who did all this work way before me and were there for me when I needed them. And one of them was Dalit Baum, who, you know, there's a Facebook fan page celebrating her utter butchness. But she's a mathematician, and now she runs a group called Who Profits from the Occupation, which is an incredible website. So I wrote her, you know, Judith Butler put me in touch with her, and I wrote her and explained the situation. I didn't see how a lesbian and gay studies conference could be part of the boycott. And this is what she wrote me back. Dear Sarah, after much thought and some conversation, my recommendation to you is to decline the invitation and do it publicly. It seems odd that of all the rich conferences in Tel Aviv University, it would be our little queer studies conference that would suffer the loss. But the boycott represents a clear and valid request from a wide range of groups representing a people under extreme and violent repression. A solidarity visit could be organized and should be organized. You can have alternative events in grassroots or Palestinian venues, and use your visit to learn and teach by meeting the communities and speaking about it later abroad. One thing I was thinking about today was how much the academic boycott is really an educational tool. It's making you and me, for example, examine the implications of this visit by asking a lot of questions and contacting more people. Thank you for taking the time to see this through. So I decided that that's what I would do. You know, if somebody, and this was interesting because in my book on homophobia in the family, I talk about the importance of third-party intervention. That when someone is being victimized in front of you, you have a responsibility to intercede if they ask you for help. That was the principle of that book. And here I was, and Palestinians were asking for a boycott of state-sponsored institutions. And the more I studied it and the more I looked at it, it seemed like the only viable nonviolent tactic for change. I started to come to that conclusion. And as I started to talk to other people, and I still to this day, when someone says, oh, you know, the boycott is a terrible idea, I say, well, what is your idea? Because I'm open to a better idea. I'd like to hear an idea that can be effective, that's nonviolent, and that people can do without disrupting their own moral sense. And the boycott is the strategy that meets those criteria for me. So the more I looked into it, the more it made sense. That you're not boycotting Israel. You can still go to Israel and talk to Israelis. It's staying away from institutions that are state-funded and that normalize the occupation. And in Israel, all the universities are state-funded. So I wrote the following letter to the people from the studies conference, who are still my friends today, by the way. Dear friends, thank you so much for the great honor of being invited to keynote the LGBT Studies Conference at Tel Aviv University. I respect and admire you and all the queer people around the world courageously trying to build awareness and knowledge about our history and points of view. Very sadly and with great concern, I unfortunately must decline because the conference's university sponsor is included in the guidelines of the Palestine Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. These are as institutions that are not actively and explicitly anti-occupation. This is not a boycott of LGBT people, but rather of Israeli institutions that normalize the occupation. There are increasing numbers of Jews committed to social justice who are being forced into this position by Israeli government policies, and may I add, the role of the United States in supporting these policies. And I hope instead to come on a solidarity visit in the near future and would love the opportunity to meet with Palestinians and Israeli queers to discuss the pressing issues of our survival in the context of an anti-occupation movement. Yours sincerely, Sarah Schulman. So I sent this letter to everyone who I had consulted, and I also sent it to Omar Barghouti, who is the head of the Palestine Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. And very quickly after that, I received a letter from him. Dear Sarah, I warmly thank you for your principled position in applying the Palestinian academic and cultural boycott of Israel guidelines for the international boycott. It's quite inspiring. We in PACB hope that such a courageous position will become more common to the U.S. academic and intellectual circles. And that moment I thought, I wonder what he thinks of queers. I had this panic. Because, in the history of the U.S. left, and there may be some people in this room who are veterans of those decisions, some mistakes have been made. The left supported Cuba when queer people were profoundly oppressed. And, I didn't want to be part of that. And it's interesting because I had never met a Palestinian queer person. I had never heard of a Palestinian queer organization. I had no sign of them. But I knew in my heart that they existed. So I didn't want to participate in anything that might be detrimental to them. So I wrote him back, and it wasn't that I wrote him back. I went to John Grayson and Elle Flanders in Toronto, and they, by the way, returned my phone call, and asked them for help, and they went to Omar, and they arranged that I would come to Ramallah and meet with him to talk about queer politics. So that was the arrangement. So I go to Israel. My tour there was organized by these very fierce Israeli dykes who were part of an anarchist organization there. And they, I have a lot of relatives in Israel. My relatives range from Lubavitchers to people who live on a kibbutz that raises pigs and sells pork products. Kibbutz Mizrah. So I have the whole thing. But I didn't have a deep relationship, but I didn't have any connections at all. So these girls set this thing up. So I get there, and it was really, so I did the solidarity visit part. I spoke at the Rogatko, which is an anarchist vegan cafe in Tel Aviv. The name means the slingshot, right, of David and Goliath. And I had like 60 people, including the organizers from the conference, who came to hear me, and they were like, we totally understand why you did that. They're there and they have to live there. But the people that I was in contact with anyway were very sympathetic. And I got to talk to the same people I would have talked to if I had gone. So I realized that I could boycott and communicate with people. And that was really important. And then I went to this very cool space. It's the Haifa Women's Center, where there's 3 groups that share the space. One is Aswat, which is the Palestinian lesbian organization. So that was the first time I realized that there was a Palestinian queer organization. And the other is QAIA-NYC, which is the Palestinian Feminist Coalition, of which Aswat is an open member. And then the third is this really cool Jewish women's peace group called Isha LaIsha, and their work is fantastic. So these 3 groups share this space, and I went, and again we had about 60 people, and we had this great conversation. So after that, it was time to go to the West Bank. So the anarchists took me to Belin. Now Belin is a village that has been having demonstrations every Friday against the wall. And if you saw the film 5 Broken Cameras, that is about that village. So I drove in. Now the anarchists were all young. I think I'm young, but apparently that's only I think that. And they asked me to sit in the front seat so that if the police stopped us, I could say I was their mother. Anyway, it took me a while to get over that one. Okay. So we get to Belin, and there's a lot of internationals there, and of the Israelis that were there, I would say 80% were queer. I mean, it was just really, that was just a lot of queer people involved in that kind of solidarity stuff. So, first we meet people, and we have a big meal, and everyone's talking, and there's about 1,200 people, I think, in this village, and we're marching around, and then the Israeli soldiers appear. And it was such a weird feeling for me, because of course they look like me. Right? Because if I lived there, I would be them or something, maybe. Who knows? But, it's my... And, the people that I grew up with, and some of you are here, became like social workers and teachers and things like that. Jews in America, as you all know, do not usually get involved in the enforcement apparatus of the state. Right? Like cop and military are not big Jewish careers in the United States. And here I am seeing these people who look exactly like me, and then they start shooting this tear gas, and nothing was happening. There was no violence, there was nothing. We're just standing there, basically. And they shoot this tear gas, and it's this kind of tear gas that tells you that you're suffocating. It's a neurological thing. So the people from the town carry these cut onions in their pockets, and they take them out and they smell them to override the smell of the tear gas. And I'm standing there looking at this, and I had this like my head turned, something changed inside me. And I just got, I remember asking myself, who is we? Who is we? And me and those soldiers were not we. You know, it was me and these queer Palestinians I had just met, and these Isha women, and these anarchists. We were we. And I just had this break from this whole binary. You know, when Jews talk to each other about Israel, they're like, they're going to push us into the sea. But there was no more us. You know, it was just a break that the people that I'm with are the people who are looking for some kind of fair society and a democratic society, or a place where people are treated with decency. That's my we. And that moment was just really key for me. So then after that, I took a group taxi to Ramallah, and I got there. And of course, you know, by this time everything was all set up, and I had this contact with this very cute gay guy, young guy, who was part of this group called Al-Qaus. So Al-Qaus is the Palestinian LGBT group. And what's really, in fact, he's here. Hi. There he is. Can you wave? He's here from Ramallah, Palestine, from Al-Qaus. So Al-Qaus is, interestingly, the only Palestinian organization that exists across the wall. Because, you know, the wall affects your imagination. It affects the way you conceptualize. But partially because of the way queer people, I think, conceptualize ourselves, Al-Qaus is able to transcend that. And so he picked me up, and we got together with a whole bunch of people, and we had this incredible conversation. It was very exciting, and people knew I was going to meet Omar the next day. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about what I should say to Omar. And it turns out that they had been trying to work with Omar in coalition, and he hadn't been very friendly about that. And so we decided that I would go in with 2 requests. So the next day I go to have this big meeting with Omar, and it really went really badly. Really bad. He was really uptight. I was really uptight. We didn't click, you know, and I said, like, you know, I'm asking for 2 things. Can you acknowledge queer support of the boycott, and can you work with the queer Palestinian group? And he was like, no. And it was, you know, I didn't know what to do, and at the end I just said, well, Omar, what can I do for you? And he said, you're creative, you'll think of something. He was right, but anyway. However, by the time Heinz picked me up after, he was like, oh, I heard it went great, because, you know, in Palestine it's like everybody. And I thought, okay, I didn't know, I thought it went horribly. Anyway, so we went back to Al-Qaus, and we talked about, you know, his, you know, the thing with Omar, and Haneen, Mikey, who is the founding director of Al-Qaus, and she's also going to be one of the keynote speakers at the Homo Nationalism and Pinkwashing Conference in April. One of the most amazing political organizers I have ever met in my life. I mean, like a visionary leader. And she is the founding director of Al-Qaus, and she's the person who has conceptualized this movement that doesn't get divided by the wall. You know, she's phenomenal. And she just said, you know, fuck Omar. I don't think she said it in those words. You should bring us to America, because the gay community doesn't know that we exist. And it was true. I didn't know. So I said, okay. So I came back, and I spent a year organizing the tour. I raised $40,000. And interestingly, 15 of that came from the Soros Foundation in Jordan, because the person in charge of gender funding there felt that a visible tour by Palestinian queers in the US would be so beneficial to queer people throughout the region that it was worth investing in. So we set up a 6-city tour, and 3 people came, Khadir from Aswad, Haneen from Al-Qaus, and Haith, and by this time there was now a 3rd organization called Palestinian Queers for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, which is also based in the West Bank. So we organized this 6-city tour. And the idea was that they would go to different elements of the queer community nationally. So we started at creating change, which sometimes I call stopping change. You know, like the left wing of the gay wing of the Democratic Party kind of expanded. Then we went to Chicago, and it was in the black gay community. Then they went to Harvard and spoke at the Kennedy School. By the time they got to CUNY, the word of mouth on Facebook was so huge that we had to turn away 220 people from the event. Yeah. And they were so funny and real, and the rapport with the audiences was incredible. They went to the Bay Area and did some events with the Arab queer community there, and then finally ended with an event at the Audre Lorde Project, since at that point we decided not to come to the center because of the history of racism at the center prior to the ban. So we had it at the Audre Lorde Project, in which there were 2 overflow rooms with feeder video that didn't really work. But anyway, there were a lot of people. And and what they kept saying over and over again was, we need 3 things. We need an end to the occupation, gay liberation, and feminism. And that those things could not be separated. So they went home, and who called them? And he really, really moved forward. He really did. It was very impressive. Now, Palestinian Queers for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions are part of the Boycott Coalition. Their name is on the website. And in fact, Omar came to New York, and he and I made a video that was shown up. Laura Flanders interviewed us for Grit TV. You can watch it. And he says any future for Palestine has to include freedom for LGBT people. So, he really, really came very, very far on this, and it was very exciting. And since then, we've just had a lot of activity. I organized the first LGBT delegation to Palestine. Jim Hubbard and I, we had the international premiere of United in Anger. It was in Palestine. Our tour was organized by El Kaus. Now we have the Homo Nationalism Conference coming up. So it's been a really life-changing and very exciting experience for me to face the reality and to change. And it's really been interesting in the last few weeks because there's been a lot of attacks on the Homo Nationalism Conference. And Alan Dershowitz has published such a jerk. Their thing is that they go after you and say that you're anti-Semitic, right? He said I was a pink anti-Semite. And it was really like, what? There's a level of rhetoric that's so crazy and pathological when you start thinking about what kind of world you want to live in and how you want to relate to other people and apply that to Israel and Palestine. There's something that comes back at you that's like, they don't say, on page 60 you say blah blah and I disagree for this reason. That's not what you get. I get this hate mail, like, she should be raped by Muslims, that was one of them, or like, this freak deserves a Rachel Corrie moment, or, it's just like annihilating, pathological way of acting, or calling everybody an anti-Semite, this sort of thing, because they don't have anything. They don't have anything that works or that makes sense. They can't have a rational conversation because their whole argument is about racial supremacy. And whenever I get into individual discussions with people, that's what I hear over and over again. They want, dominant rights for Jews in Israel. They do not want a society where every human being is treated equally. And that's always at the core of those arguments, and that's why people don't want to discuss them openly. So that's what I've come to present you. That's what I would have said before if they hadn't banned us. And I thank you so much for being here, and I really want to hear what you have to say. So thank you.
Probably, I assume a lot of you know that in the last several years, in several things, several occasions that have come up around the city, a number of elected officials have taken really bad positions and tried to close down conversations like this. So we are very happy tonight that Rosie Mendez from the City Council is here with us.
Rosie, could you please run for mayor? Okay, let me have it. Yes, Rin.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, honey. We know each other since we were 3.
We have a Yiddish account. So I actually jotted something down, that I've been wanting to say somewhere, somehow, and I appreciate having a voice here this year. It's hard not to equate boycott Israel with boycott Jews. It's visceral. This visceral response, I believe, resides in a deeply traumatized people, and that shouldn't be minimized. But a visceral reaction to trauma should not and does not equal a shutdown or a moratorium on discussion and debate. Boycott Israel does not equal boycott Jews, no matter what my viscera tells me. It's my mind, my cognition, and my sense of justice that informs me here and that can't exist simultaneously alongside my trauma as a Jew, which in my case is specific to having been a political prisoner at the age of 13 when the plane that I was a passenger in was hijacked by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and I was held hostage for a week. Nonetheless, while my limbs start to shake whenever I mention that complicated and terrifying experience, my mind is engaged in deepening my understanding of Israel's unconscionable apartheid policies and their oppression and occupation of Palestine. Traumatized people cannot afford to be blind, and they don't have to be simply visceral and emotional and reactionary. We are not merely victims of the past. We have agency. And we are the ones who move the agenda and break the boundaries and create solutions. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
times in your speech, and it seemed like sometimes we, like the words Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, were in the mix. So I wonder, what is we and what is they?
What is we and what is they? For me, we are all the people around the world who believe that by virtue of being born, every human being deserves equal rights, self-determination. That's we. That's my we. That's my team.
And they?
They are people who are invested in systems of supremacy, whether it's gender supremacy, religious or racial supremacy. Isn't it amazing that that is controversial? Unbelievable. Yes?
So is Hamas part of the they?
Hamas. Every time I do this talk, someone says, why do you? I have never supported any political party. I don't even support the Democratic Party.
Systems of supremacy.
There's always the guy who stands up and says that.
What? What's the question?
It's Hamas. What's your question?
Is it implicated?
Do I support Hamas? Is
No,
that
I'm
what
not saying do you support Hamas. I'm saying does it fit into your definition of they, which are people who are engaged in supremacy of gender or sexual orientation and so forth?
It depends. Sometimes I don't know enough about Hamas to give you a complete, intelligent analysis of Hamas. But there are people who get into all kinds of movements because they have particular needs. And I don't, let me say it this way. All over the world, there is a conflict between religion and politics. The United States, we are unable to separate religion and politics. And that's true in Israel, and it's true in the Arab world, it's true all over the world. Do I think that there should be religious governments? No, I'm not in favor of that because I'm not a religious person. And I see it as a negative force in the world. But if people will elect, democratically elect a religious government, that's their government. So that would be my answer to what you're saying. Okay, you don't have to clap. You don't have to clap at everything. It's okay, let's just relax. Let's relax, yes. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
So you started the talk speaking about what I understood as Jewish trauma, Jewish victimhood, that kind of atmosphere. But I think it's actually around the 50s where Jewish status and position also started to turn and shift in the United States. And they became from considered non-white to pretty white. So I was wondering if you think there are ways to talk also about, simultaneously to Jewish victimhood, also about Jewish privilege, Jewish American privilege, and also how it's linked to, American imperialism, colonialism, and to Jewish Ashkenazi hegemonic culture in Israel.
That's all you want me to talk about? Let me say it, let me say it my way. About the transformation, I mean, look, from 1945 to 1955, Jews went from the victim, the bottom of the most abandoned, victimized people to people who had the apparatus of the nation state and were oppressing somebody else. It's a very fast transition. And, we're having a conference on homo-nationalism because you're seeing the same thing happening with gay people. We're going from, in my generation, and I just want to say, when you've experienced something profound in your youth, even if your category becomes privileged later on, that earlier experience, you carry it with you in your heart, right? So in my queer generation, I come from a time where, in this room, this is the room where ACT UP met, okay, where our generation died by government neglect, right? That's what caused their deaths. Today, there are countries in the world where white gay people have the exact same rights as white straight people. This is not one of them. But, for example, the Netherlands, and you're seeing increasingly, once official homophobia is removed, that some white gay people are moving into these racist anti-immigrant movements. So we're in that transition right now. Where there's some people in the LGBT world globally who are moving into positions of dominance. And there are others who are profoundly oppressed. I have students on Staten Island who are profoundly oppressed. But I think in the queer movement we're trying to do what the Jewish community didn't do, which is to face that right straight on and try to understand what's happening and what it means. I never heard as a child that this land was Palestinian land and that they were forced out of their land and that they wanted it back. I never heard that once. And I don't think my parents even heard that. What we heard was that it was empty, it was a land with no people. I remember hearing these phrases, that the Jews had made the desert bloom, all that stuff, right? It was interesting, I was thinking about Israeli folk dancing. Israeli folk dancing was this big thing in the 60s, especially in New York, right? And I never thought, how could a country that's founded in 1948 have folk dancing? And then, when I started asking people, they said, oh, it's Eastern European. I was like, well, my grandparents were from Eastern Europe and they never folk danced. So, there's just a lot of stuff that I just didn't understand, because for us, it was the previous experience that was the dominant one, and that was the most influential. So, but now I think at least in the gay community, queer community, we have the responsibility of awareness. There's a lot of similarities, I just want to say that the post-AIDS trauma and the assimilation of gay people does have a lot of similarity to the post-Holocaust Jewish assimilation. This wanting to blend into the society that allowed you to be destroyed. I see the parallels they're quite strong. I actually wrote about this in my book on gentrification. Okay, yes, sir.
Yes, I've been in the pro-Palestinian movement for many years. I ask people this question all the time, and unfortunately we never get a good answer. So, what do you believe is the connection between Israeli oppression of the Palestinians and the complete support by the U.S. government of that oppression?
But we're paying for it. Why are we paying for
Why
it?
are we paying for it?
Repeat the question.
Why is the U.S. giving military aid to Israel and paying for the...
Fundamental structure is supported by the United States in military aid and civil aid and all kinds of laws relating to civil society.
You know, of course I don't know the answer, but I have some ideas about it. It's a convenient military base for us. There's Christian Zionism is an integrated part of Christian culture in the United States. We just had a Christian Zionist president, George Bush. Raised Islamophobia, because we are basically a Christian country. But you know, I can't do better than that. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert, but that would be my impulse. And somebody else want to answer that?
Money.
Yeah, but what does that mean exactly?
We also benefit from colonialism here.
Do you want to speak?
I mean, not, not really, but...
Yes, hi. What's that?
Guilt from the Holocaust that he threw enough.
I'm not sure about that. Okay. Yes.
The reason
Yes.
comes up all the time. The Israeli journalist, Gideon Levy, who writes the Haaretz, and he's very clear. He said, none of this stuff in Israel, particularly the recent occupation since 1967, will end if it's up to the Israelis. He said, but the United States has the power to end it in one day if they exercise that power. And we have two examples of it being done. We have the Eisenhower Ben Gurion in the Sinai, when the Israelis invaded, took over the Suez Canal with the French and British. And then we have a similar situation between Carter and Begin.
Let me answer it.
Sarah, can you please repeat?
It's about a U.S. military aid to Israel. My feeling, and this is just me, I don't have anything to back this up. I think it's more likely that the United States will change than that Israel will change. And from my experience in the gay movement and in the AIDS movement, I think I do understand how the United States changes, is that it doesn't change from the center, it changes from subcultures. Right? So when significant subcultures move forward on Israel and Palestine, the United States will move forward. Now, what are those subcultures? I would say LGBT, academics, artists, students, Arab Americans, African Americans, and secular Jews. Also progressive churches. And those are communities where there is a lot of movement on Israel and Palestine right now. Because these subcultures, like ours, people know each other, they have their own leaders, they have their own venues for communication, they don't trust the dominant cultural media to give them information. And you know, in terms of Students for Justice in Palestine, these organizations are all over universities now. I visited 8 of them this year. There just was a successful divestment vote at University of California, Riverside, and before that at Irvine, and Stanford came very close. You know, so you're starting to see campuses that it's very similar to the South Africa divestment movement, and I think it's possible that the Students for Justice in Palestine movement could become the student movement in the United States if you start getting some more divestment going on, some more campaigns going on in schools. So LGBT community is having a lot of discussions. The conference we're having at CUNY in terms of academics has sold out 400 tickets 6 months in advance. And I don't know what you know about academic conferences. There's 181 speakers at this conference. You know, these are professors, so graduate students. So, you know, that's where I think the action is, and the goal is to change U.S. policy. Yeah. Yes, Sherry.
First, I really encourage people to get Sarah's book. I've read it. It's excellent.
Thank you.
You obviously kicked open the door at the New York Times in getting your piece on pinkwashing a year and a half ago, or before Thanksgiving, and now it's continued with this recent piece this weekend, questioning, or a philosopher from the University of Massachusetts questioning whether or not Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish state, which is actually a very powerful piece. it seems to be we're at a turning point even yet further in the BDS movement. What do you account for? Do you think this is a sort of a third intifada, which has been suggested by Nada Elia, the Palestinian academic and writer and speaker? Where do you see this? We appear to be at a certain turning point, certainly in consciousness in the United States and even beyond that globally. Where do you see this going in terms of Israeli policy?
Sherry, where do you see it going?
I think people dig in their heels. I think we'll be made even greater pariahs, and I think we're going to have to escalate beyond that. But within the BDS movement, but I don't see them changing.
I think that, you know, New York Jews, who are key to a lot of this, it's more and more difficult for us to lie to ourselves about the Israeli state. And as more people who are reasonable are coming forward and challenging these ideas, the conversation is moving forward. I mean, there was an article in the Jewish Daily Forward, of all places, saying, hey, guess what? Jewish Voice for Peace is not anti-Semitic. You may disagree with them, but stop calling these people anti-Semitic. And that was the Jewish Daily Forward, okay? So things, you know, it's just from people talking to each other and being reasonable. And I think that the kind of Dershowitz-y stuff is getting much more marginal, honestly. Yes?
So I guess there's kind of a little bit of backstory. I went to Israel, I guess about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago. Started learning Hebrew, started the application for Aliyah. Almost moved to Israel before I met my boyfriend, who I've now been with for a little over a year and a half. And I think that for me, I guess I kind of see some parallels between my experience and your experience to an extent, in that I think that it's kind of a difficult line to walk where, you know, I grew up in a Jewish home, I have Jewish parents who I've gotten in a couple of fights with at this point about whether being anti-Israel is the same thing as being anti-Semitic, including one very heated one. But I guess, how did you find yourself kind of moving from growing up in a Jewish home where Israel was kind of the homeland, and it's the place that...
Well, that wasn't my home, but yeah.
No,
not the homeland, but you know.
But kind of the homeland for Jews, and the place that was kind of a place of safety, which is kind of the way that I was brought up, was that it was the place that Jews fled to after the Holocaust. It was the place that they could call their own, and it was the first time that we had something that we could call our own. How did you kind of shift from growing up in a traditional Jewish home where you didn't really question Israel to where you are now? Because I feel like I'm kind of moving in that sort of direction. And
I mean, honestly, I didn't grow up with the idea that Israel was our homeland, New York City. We were raised that the best place for Jews in the world is New York City, and I still believe that. But you know, like at each point, like as I was going through all these changes and doing very dramatic things that I wasn't totally sure about, at each point I just had to sit down and think, like, what are my fundamental values? I fundamentally believe that all human beings deserve equal rights, that all human beings deserve equal opportunity. I've lived that way my whole life. Why, when I come to Israel, would it be different? Why would that be the sudden place in my life where I believe in racial supremacy or religious supremacy? It doesn't make any sense. You know, so, I mean, like, you know, Rin talked about, especially in my generation, I'm 54. So there's this deep emotionality around all of this, but it doesn't add up to racism. It doesn't. I wasn't raised that way, I don't believe that, I've never acted that way in any other front. Why would this be the exception? That's just what I kept coming back to. Yes?
I had the opportunity of working for Rabbi Schulman Rights North America and went on a human rights mission. And we spent 6 of the 10 days in the West Bank and in the Negev. And I think what's really important is, as part of what Sherry was talking about, is that we have to stop having stereotypes about Palestinians and Muslims
all Palestinians are not Muslim. We stayed for 2 nights with a Christian family, with Santa Claus around. And we met with queer Palestinians. And there's a huge peace movement in Palestine. We met with a professor who talked about the history of nonviolent resistance in Palestine against what is happening to them. And that it's really important for us to educate ourselves and get to know Muslims and Palestinians and stop stereotyping them the way we did with African Americans. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, so of course I was a racist. You've got to educate yourself.
Well, one thing I could suggest is reading Electronic Intifada. I don't know if everybody knows about it, but it's really like a go-to place for information. And also Mondo Weiss is another great website. Yeah, Lori.
You know, when I think about this, I think that there's several threads or narratives, and there's the personal or human narrative that when you speak to what you believe that all people are humans that deserve equal rights. That's like the struggle of human civil society when you get to identify with that finally, where the boundaries of nation states drop away and you begin to identify and understand that struggle across difference. But then there's the thread of the government-military complex and the strategy that they are putting into place at all times. And out of World War II and the demise of so many countries and such devastation economically in so many countries in Europe, Russia, because we have more ability to do it. We're at the top. So when we look at it that way, and we can understand what we oppose and why we oppose our own government's enterprise of death, you know, and destruction, and then you can look at what Israel is doing. We're struggling against it in that way without then identifying as Jews or as, you know, we're at risk as Americans. We're at risk as humans. We're really, really, all of us, at that risk if we're depending on where we are in civil society. So I think that's how to deconstruct it ultimately, to keep coming back to that and identifying with each other on that level, because we're all at risk at this point.
Okay, thank you, Lori. Yes?
Just to pick up on what she was saying, I noticed you spoke a lot about state-funded universities here, that you're mounting your boycotting of state institutions in Israel. Isn't that a little, should queers be opposing, aren't we peak-washing our occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, where the United States Air Force kills more people in a week than the Israeli army has killed since 1947? Well, sure. And also, it's a disingenuous answer if you want to pose as someone who is a human of the world for universal rights, and to skirt disingenuously the issue of Hamas, because their supremacist ideology and their vicious misogyny and homophobia are well known. And to just say, well, they voted for it, so that's fine. You could say the same thing about the Israelis voted for Likud, so that's fine, but you don't say that. And I think and I liked a lot of your presentation, but it was disingenuous to just say, well, I don't know about Hamas. I don't know about this supremacist ideology throughout the Muslim world. I don't know about that. I'm just concerned about it's disingenuous.
You know, when Palestine is free, they will choose their government, right? We just had a black gay man who was a candidate for mayor in Mississippi who was murdered and burned to death in the United States. So
boycott the United States.
Well, you know, no.
Boycott the United States state-funded.
The reason I'm supporting this boycott is because it's organized by Palestinians who are asking us to support them. And I've decided to support them. There is an organized also boycotted different things. I remember boycotting Coors because they opposed gay rights, and I remember boycotting grapes, and I was at the center for 2 years. And if you organize a boycott of some American institution and people who are being oppressed by it are asking for boycott, I'm sure I would support it as well. But those other boycotts don't exist right now. Yes. Yes.
So, thank you for your talk. Amazing. I'm a trans anti-Zionist Jew in my family, and coming out as trans and queer was pretty easy for me, but coming out as anti-Zionist was I was isolated from my family. I got, taken out of my will for a minute. Things got really intense and hard, and a lot of emotional violence, things like that. Anyway, I can't help but think about that because you're talking about homophobia in the family, you're talking about being an anti-Zionist Jew, and I was just wondering if there was any way that you were ever going to kind of start writing about the way that people are coming out all over the place and the experiences that they're having.
Well, I wrote this book, Ties That Bind, which is, I think, the only analysis of homophobia in the family, how it's constructed and what its consequences are on the society. So I have addressed all of that. But that's the way it goes. That's the way it goes. I mean, you have to be able to face yourself and be the person you want to be, and when you tell the truth in certain moments in history, some people get angry and try to punish you, and that's the way it is. I don't have a way out for you. Yeah.
Quick question, Sarah. How would you respond to a statement that pinkwashing is not real? That pinkwashing is the result of Israel just being progressive in its politics and wanting to let the world know and inviting tourism, and it actually has nothing to do with the pressures?
Okay, well, I mean, I can't give you everything, but I do have a whole chapter with lots of footnotes. Basically, in 2003, Israel started to work with Saatchi & Saatchi, the advertising firm, which gave them 2 years of pro bono work to reposition them and remarket them in the eyes of the world. At that point, Israel rated, in terms of popularity, between Yemen and Sudan in the world view. So the idea was to remarket Israel, and Saatchi came up with a plan called Brand Israel. And that's what they call it. I don't call it that. Everything is footnoted. You can check all my footnotes, as Duke University Press did. Okay. And so the way they decided to market this was to go to the most influential market slice in the world, which is men ages 16 to 24. If men ages 16 to 24 believe something, it's real. So the first thing they did, because, by the way, it's interesting because there's no pinkwashing to lesbians, it's only to men. Okay, because when you have a community of men's incomes, that's who you want to get. The first thing they did was a spread in Maxim magazine, Women of the IDF, that's the Israeli Defense Forces, and it was like these sexy Israeli female soldiers in bikinis on tanks with machine guns and stuff like that. And then the next week they surveyed the readers of Maxim, and they all reported a more favorable view of Israel. Then they started having free visits for architectural writers and for food and wine writers. And right now, any field that you're in, if you're a professional, there's a free visit to Israel waiting for you. They are soliciting everybody. So you're a food and wine writer, you get a free visit, you get all this great food. They put you up, you love it, you think it's great. They're going for this culturally influential edge. But who of that male category has the most discretionary income and is most influential in terms of cultural change? Gay men. And that's when you start... Yes. Right, because if you're a gay man with an Arab last name, Israel is not a good vacation destination. So then they start having, cheap flights from Berlin and London, and this kind of, a lot of money coming through the foreign ministry, through the government, through the tourism ministry, to promote Israel as a place as a gay tourism destination. And this is all because in our world, something like gay pride in Tel Aviv is emblematic of modernity. Right? Because we're still living in the past. We're living in this idea that gay people are at the bottom of every society, and if a society has gay pride, it means it's a progressive society. But that is no longer the truth. Gay people are not at the bottom of every society. You know, so it's playing with people's emotions, and it's also exploiting, in my view, the hard-won gains of the LGBT movement in Israel, and using it to whitewash the occupation. And I want to say that the word pinkwashing was coined by Ali Abunimah from Electronic Intifada. He's gotten no credit for this, because Jews, like myself, are constantly being used to substitute for Palestinians, for their achievements, for the work that they've done, for the positions that they've developed. But that's where it comes from. And because he said, look, they're greenwashing, which they are, and they've always been whitewashing, now they're pinkwashing. So the idea is that if they have gay pride in Tel Aviv, the occupation doesn't matter. Because Israel is a progressive country, right? That's what pinkwashing means. It's using two things that have nothing to do with each other. It doesn't matter. So what? I mean, it's great that, or whatever, I don't care. There's gay pride in Tel Aviv. It has nothing to do with the occupation. It's a false equation that we're constantly being, facing a repetition. Yes, this is Jason Littman, and I just have to say, Jason is someone who has worked with AIPAC, with Birthright, with the Jewish National Front, and is now the leader of Wider Bridge, which is trying to create a pro-Israel presence in the gay community. Jason.
My name's Jason. I know when we started, I said I wouldn't ask you any questions, but I actually have one question to ask. In your definition of pinkwashing, how do you resolve the fact that you're bringing Palestinian queer organizations to the Western world and showing the people that there are queer Palestinians, there are queers of Arab descent? How is that not a pinkwashing same type of term? Because you're showing us that there is queer life in these Palestinian areas without telling people that there is no rights for queer Palestinians in those areas. So you're pretty much pinkwashing the same way you accuse us of.
She's prolific, but she's not a government.
Does anybody want to, Heist, do you want to answer that?
Well, why can't you answer that?
We don't exist, according to him, until you say that we do. It doesn't exist.
That's right.
First of all, we didn't come here to show people that Palestinian queers exist, because if you thought that Palestinian queers did not exist, then you had a problem. We came here to create a space for our own discourse, for what we want and what we think, how you can support Palestinian queers, because for so long it was people who were pinkwashing, who were using our names and saying what people should do to be in support with Palestinian queers. To be in support with Palestinian queers, you need to be in support of the Palestinian oppressing the Palestinians. You need to support the Israelis because they're oppressing the Palestinians because the Palestinians are homophobic.
And
so we came here to say that us as Palestinian queers do not agree with that. We came so that people can hear our voice. So I don't think that equates with showing how gay-friendly Israel is to try and whitewash Israel's crimes. And at the same time, pinkwashing is something that has a power concept. It's something that has a power.
Only you can save us.
By addressing us.
Yeah, by addressing us. And now, please, because we've listened, I want to, this is really easy. The gentleman who was talking about the military aid that goes, it's not some weird military ambiguous thing. It's our tax dollars.
Yes.
It's the people that you elect that make the budget. Don't make it somebody else is doing this, not you. And the billions of dollars that go toward military aid is this tiny, insignificant rounding error compared to what is the vast majority of the gross national product of design in the state. Does anybody know what that is?
What is it?
No, of course you don't. It's the diamond trays. So when you all are, now that you can get married in this state, listen correctly, boycott the diamond trade and tell
Lynn. I also want to recognize Lynn, who's here from MEME, which is a queer group in Beirut, and it's queer women and trans people. Okay, MEME is queer women and trans people from Lebanon. Do we have a group like that? No. Hi, welcome. Okay. Yes.
First of all, you said that anybody wants, from any profession, wants to go to university. It's open, so if you can find something for social engineer, I would really appreciate it. I couldn't find it. We are speaking about criticism against Israel and against the policies of the government, but nobody is offering any solutions. So what is your view of solutions? I mean, resolving the situation.
My personal...
Sorry, I forgot something. The people in Israel explain that the reason there is a war between Israeli and Palestine, and by the way, Palestinians are not citizens of the United States. They are citizens of Israelis, but not Palestinians.
Yes, they are.
Okay. Sorry. So people in Israel would claim that the wall is for security reasons, because indeed, since the wall was created, there are much less terrorist attacks against Israelis and people in Israel dying from terrorist attacks. So the wall was created and it served a certain purpose. So, like, if we say that it's for security, we are saying it's just for the purpose of some kind of security among the Jewish people, then can you explain that and if you have any solution?
Does anybody else want to answer that? No, I was here as Palestinian. Let him answer.
Because you asked a question that will throw your goal very easily, but when there is a question from the other side, you won't answer. So say, I don't have an answer, and somebody answer, or just say.
No, it's that there's Palestinians here. Why should I speak for them? Go ahead.
And that will have security. You cannot continue doing that and say, oh my God, the Palestinians are attacking us. Who is going to attack them? Because they have a right.
Let me just answer a little bit. It's okay. Okay, relax. Okay, relax. Let me answer. Shh. Okay. My personal vision, and it's not up to me. We end U.S. military aid to Israel.
Yeah.
See, I think that if you and I are in a room together, we should both decide how cold or warm it should be in that room. I think that by virtue of living in a place, everyone who lives there should have a say over how things are decided. Right? So if we end U.S. military aid to Israel, then there's a bunch of different scenarios of how things can shake out. But however it goes, it's not going to be a situation where Israelis decide how Palestinians are going to live. That's the thing that has to change. Okay, yes.
Sorry, my voice isn't that loud. I'll try. Well, first, I really want to thank you for really insightful and touching journey that you described, that sense of having a paradigm shift in your awareness and your ability to be a principle of existence. And I think that many of us can empathize with that. And I think maybe you can answer this question for me, because I feel personally conflicted about boycotting for many reasons, mostly because I'm the exact, polar opposite of your identity. As a gay Arab, I'm the other, and I have to think from the other's perspective. In my society, I am the minority, the oppressed minority, the minority that doesn't yet have the tools of agency to make change yet. And I have to think, I think the way you think of, leftist stance on Cuba in the 60s, would you want to stand ideologically with an entity that criminalizes you or sees you as inferior in any way? So I had a similar situation where I felt how you felt during that uprising in Benin when they were doing the protests, and you felt like a change in how you see us and them. And that was in Tel Aviv. It was one day on a visit to Israel, the first time as someone who grew up and lived all my life in Egypt, to realize that us and them wasn't Arab and Israeli. I was surrounded by Israeli friends, gay, straight, mostly leftists, who had this understanding that the has to end, and there is a place where we can have a peaceful existence. And the us and them was no longer us and them as national binaries, but more like us and them, us who share a dream of a better future where we don't have to be divided along lines of ethnicity, religion, etc. And them can be, someone who is an illegal settler in the West Bank, or them could be, a systematically oppressive government in Saudi Arabia. And so that principle existed. Then we attempted to boycott some of what we did. Of course, in the Arab world, it's very different when you question the status quo, because you don't even have the leeway that you have here, where anything we struggle with here is being accused of being, like, say, anti-Semitic. In the Arab world, to me, taking a stance like saying I would never visit Saudi Arabia as an Arab because it's a place that systematically beheads gays or systematically oppresses women to the point where you have no rights whatsoever, isn't taken. I mean, I would understand a lot of times the kind of resistance I've met in the Arab world when I took a stance like that. But my biggest surprise in the trail was among leftists here in the United States. Instead of feeling sympathetic to a stance like that, where you are questioning the status quo, where you are taking a stance, not even taking anything like divestment, God forbid, but a simple stance, like I'm not going to travel to a country that treats my people as criminals, or again, taking a stance like that. I mean, even with people, and I say my friends, I go evidence because I've never made statistics around the real, but among the left, I found that the same person who will more likely to be take a very sympathetic stance towards the Palestinian cause, which is commendable and wonderful, and I love that people are taking such a stance and exploring. The same person who would take that kind of stance in the same breath would say something along the lines of, oh yeah, I think we fabulous, we went back happy through Yemen, or I would love to explore Saudi Arabia, or maybe go to Isfahan, Iran one day. And you bring the point that you're queer and you're a leftist, and shouldn't you be standing with your queer brethren who are suffering, who want you to take a stance of sorts, but they see it, there's a complete disconnect. And I'm wondering, as someone who has struggled with that idea of boycott as a means of resistance, of making your point across in a peaceful way, have you struggled with the idea of expanding, where it's not just about Israel, but generally applying this principled stance anywhere where there are these systematic entities of pressure?
Okay. Well, the first thing is, I guess you don't know me very well, but I've been involved in politics my entire life. And I've made a stand with a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different kinds of circumstances. But I will say that one thing I've learned from all of that is that people can only be where they're at. And the best kind of movements are movements that are flexible and allow for simultaneity of action. And that's what we learned when Jim and I have done the ACT UP Oral History Project. That's why ACT UP was successful. Because there was no correct line, and there was no consensus, and nobody was forced to take a position that didn't work for them. But people were allowed to act in a way that was appropriate to where they were at. And that, to me, is the best model for a movement. Okay? Yes?
U.S. should be putting pressure on Israel to sort of engage in some sort of peace process. That was as far as I could get with Israel. I will never get him or any of my other extended family to agree to engage in a boycott against Israel. It just seems like sort of out of the question. So I've been trying to brainstorm, what could I get these people to do? How could they engage in putting pressure on Israel in a way that they would feel comfortable with? And one of the things I've been thinking about is I think my father might be comfortable trying to encourage or being involved in trying to facilitate sort of work with the Israeli left and the Israeli peace movement. And I was wondering if you have any sort of thoughts about how that's how that happened.
I understand. You know, I just want to say, you don't have to convince everybody to make change, okay? Change is made by not a majority, but by a critical mass. Most people do not participate in the political process. And you know, ACT UP at its height, the largest demonstration we ever had was only 7,000 people. So if you have a critical mass of people who are effective and committed, you can make enormous paradigm shifts. So you don't have to convince everybody. I recommend Jewish Voice for Peace. I think it's an incredible organization, and they have a lot of different kinds of activities going on. There might be something there that he relates to. If the only thing he can do is work with an Israeli progressive movement, that's great. But don't kill yourself trying to convince your father to change, because it's not about making every person in your life think like you. It's not about that. Yes, right there. You. Yes.
I'm here first of all because of Rachel Curry and Iman Al-Ghamzari. And I'm happy with the movement that the queer LGBTQ youth is doing, but I feel like if we would band together and target it from like a child with mental health aspect, more people would be drawn to it. Like I have children, I would never want them to grow up under occupation. And not to say that, you know, gay rights isn't important, but from that aspect, a lot of more people will be drawn to it because it's children, child abuse. And I think it's like a bad experiment that's happening. How do you expect people not to grow up feeling a type of way against their neighbors that are oppressing them? Like someone mentioned with the wall, it's for safety, it's for this and it's for that. But when I read into it, because it's a Palestinian land and all these different types of things, and I wish that there were more African American people here. And I was involved in public school because I always loved social studies, global history. They never taught me. I remember how I was crying and everything. It was like, oh my God, my Jewish neighbor. Crown Heights, Flatbush, that's where I'm from. So I know that there's like a separation, even though we don't have a wall. They spend their money in their own community. It doesn't really come out to our corner stores or whatever else that we have. So the divestment is good, but if you tackle it from like a child abuse mental health, more people will be drawn to it. And also from tax dollars, like I'm broke, I don't want my taxes going towards this anymore. You have to definitely get some of the Christian leaders or the mega churches like the TV Jakes and the President Dollars. And those people, you have to get them on board because this is a Christian country. And I'm seeing a lot more progress with the gay rights, but as far as human rights and what we're funding, there has to be something said. And that was just...
I understand. What I want to say is that, yeah.
Because we have too many things in common, both from Crown Heights and both broke. You're Israeli?
Yes.
I want to take like 4 minutes to give you the liberty or social experience that I had. I grew up in the West Bank. Okay? Growing up in the West Bank, I am used to standing in a different line than the Jewish people. Now I live in Crown Heights. Now we both go to Bank of America and we stand in line. This is a trip in my mind. I can't understand it. No, hold on 1 second. You know, I'm talking about an African American person pulled out of Texas in 1930, thrown at Times Square right now, 2013, surrounded by all these white people. He'd be trying to hide somewhere. Because he was thinking, those people are out here to kill me. You know? You don't know that. What she said is really important. I grew up, I was niggerized by the Israelis for 24 years in my life. I had so much anger. If you want to get everybody who was a kippah.
But guess what? Even if there is any hate against Jewish people, my nose is like a magnet for that. So I get even that, and they do hit me, will be hitting on me. Dude, I pay the price double. Even my own people, the people that I don't know in person, the Palestinians, think that I'm a spy for the Israelis, that I look Jewish. I've been getting shit from everybody. The Israelis gave me shit for 24 years. I have so much anger against the Jewish nation, the Israelis. I cannot deny this. Even if I go to Guantanamo, I have so much hate. But it was all classified living in Brooklyn for 6 years, where kosher delis are run by Palestinians. You have to understand that most of the last names of people who I live with, including my landlord, is in Hebron bothering the shit out of my people right now. And hold on, excuse me. The problem is, if you feel that one race's blood is more valuable than another blood, that is fucked up.
Okay, that's it.
So we have this problem with progressives except Palestine. So it's a problem in the world of Jews where, not to say that all Jews are progressive or that even the larger Jewish community is progressive, but there is a Jewish portion of the world that thinks that it's progressive, and then when it gets to Israel, it like smacks the wall and falls. And queers have the same problem, progressive except Palestine, because it's so easy to adopt anti-Muslim, anti-Arab bias, and sort of homophobic, like gay wound, whatever. So my question is, so you've been touring, talking to the other gays, not in New York, and well, just to walk back a little bit, in 2002, at the beginning of this current wave of anti-occupation organizing that has its roots in old feminist anti-occupation organizing, that's much older than many of us. It was harder for those of us who were starting then to really explain how bad what Israel was doing was to people who were willing to accept anti-Muslim bias. But over the course of time, in the fullness of time, Israel has sort of moved forward in the last 10 years to now, sterilizing and deporting Ethiopians. The sort of racial picture of what's going on in Israel has gotten much worse. And yet we still have this problem of progressives except Palestine. So I'm just wondering, in your travels, how that has played out. Are other progressives except Palestine really less progressive? Are they more willing to accept racism? Are they turning a blind eye? And how should we be thinking about talking to them about what's really going on?
I'm seeing that with younger people, there's a lot more understanding of what the real situation is with the occupation. And I've been to, just in the last month, I think I've been to 3 or 4 campuses that have students for Justice in Palestine or students for Free Palestine. And they are really integrated into the rest of the student body. They're doing lots of events in coalition with other communities in the school, including queers, including the African American student organizations. And they're planning or working on divestment, and that's where our support should be. And what's really interesting, when you go there, they'll say, oh, Ali was just here last month. Oh, Dalit is coming. The adults are coming through there, and I'm starting to see how important that is. Because there's, students come to college, they're only there for a few years. They need some information about ideas for organizing. And Students for Justice in Palestine is its own coalition, but there's also other groups that are not part of that. And it's very exciting. And Jewish Voice for Peace is an unbelievable organization, and they're getting more and more successful and getting larger. So I think it's going in a really good direction. I'm very optimistic, Amaya. And thank you for all the work you have done. And thank you to all of you. And let's keep our center ours. Thank you.
Before you all leave, I just want to remind people that there are some of Sarah's books are for sale. Over here to my right, on the wall over here, the blue stockings bookstore is here. And please make sure to get the statement from Queers Against Israeli Apartheid and come to our meetings in April. Thank you.